You're looking to buy a plasma cutter. It'd be great if you could just go out and buy an established high quality brand like a Hypertherm 45XP for 2,500 bucks, but you're watching this video, so I doubt you're about to go and do that. Let me show you an option for literally 10 times less money that'll give you all the capability you'll need for your average DIYer in a concise video that won't waste your time.
Bestarc reached out to me wanting me to test their 7th generation 50 amp plasma cutter. Having a fancy Hypertherm cutter, I first thought, why? But then I remembered I can't actually use my Hypertherm currently because it's designed to do all of its cutting at 45 amps on 220, and my shop currently only has one plug that can accommodate that, which is consumed by my large air compressor. These cheaper plasma cutters are meant to have their amperage adjusted manually to accommodate the material, rather than fancy tech inside the unit compensating for you. Not only that, but this Bestarc plasma cutter is able to run on 110 volts, so truly anyone can use this in their garage as long as you have a decent air compressor and aren't trying to cut thick materials. I'll explain those limitations here shortly. Plus, when I looked into these units, they're the best-selling plasma cutter on Amazon and have been around for a while, so I really couldn't say no to getting my hands on one. The Bestarc BTC500DP 7th generation plasma cutter comes with the plasma cutter, earth clamp, cutting torch, 2 extra tips and electrodes, which are consumables, so it's nice to have spares already on hand, a 220-110 adapter, and an air hose with some hose clamps. I don't know who would ever use this air hose since you just pop your shop's air hose into the back, but here it is. To walk you through the features, this first button switches between adjusting the air and the cutting mode. This air adjustment is pretty slick. It has a built-in air pressure display that when you go to adjust it with this knob here, has air flow through the system, so you're actually measuring the air pressure in use and not static. Going back to the cut mode sets this pressure and you can then use the cutter. Next, you have the activation modes for using the torch. Essentially, the 2T means you pull in the trigger, which then activates the cutter, and hold it in until releasing it, which then turns off the cutter, which is 2 actions for a cutting cycle. The 4T means that you pull in the trigger to start it, it starts, then you can let go of the trigger, and it'll continue cutting until you pull the trigger in again, and then release it, at which point it stops cutting, which is 4 actions for a cutting cycle. This last section allows you to adjust the post-time airflow and the pilot arc time. The post-time sets how long the air continues to flow out of the nozzle after you finish cutting. That airflow is important to cool down the consumables after each cut to allow them to last longer. A short time is all you need for thinner materials or shorter duration cuts, and a longer time for thicker materials or longer duration cuts. Pilot arc time relates to what you're trying to cut. Basically, it starts the plasma before you touch the material so you can ease into your cuts nicely. If you ever used a plasma cutter without the feature, you'll know it's really annoying getting the arc started sometimes and can make for an ugly start to your cut. Additionally, if you're cutting expanded or wire material, you can increase your pilot arc time and it allows you to just keep moving along the material and it'll keep cutting.
Something that you have to keep in mind when you're cutting on 110, realistically, you probably only have a 20 amp circuit that you're plugging into. Potentially, you could have something that's 30 or maybe even 50 amps, but that's some kind of special plug that you likely don't have access to. So although this can be adjusted up to 35 amps, you can't actually use it. That's sort of a gimmick of the product. You can get away with it for maybe 10 to 30 seconds from what I've seen, but you're going to blow your breaker and eventually you're going to hurt your breaker box and either degrade the breaker and maybe cause a fire in your house at some point. So don't go above 20 amps if you're going to use this on 110 in a 20 amp circuit. So let me show you cutting it 7 gauge material at 20 amps on 110 voltage. Not bad, and it's literally me using this machine for the first time. Just learning it, that's a pretty nice edge. Just for the sake of argument, I'll show it trying to cut 3/8 at 375. So, notice it just overheated. Or did it pop the breaker? You can tell it wasn't happy about that. Even running it at just 20 amps on 110, you're really pushing its limits. But it did cut it. Is it ugly? Yeah, but it cut it. Okay, now I'm on 220, but I'm using a 30 amp plug. I had to make my own little converter for this because it comes with a 6-50R, and a 30 amp plug is typically something like a 14-30R plug. This is 3/16 here. That was really nice. So that cut like nothing. You know, again, some dross theoretically make that better. Just getting the speed at which you travel and the air pressure just right, but the actual cut itself is really nice. And there it is with the dross knocked off. You really can't complain with that cut quality. And that says that's the max for 30 amps. And you should be cutting, but quite frankly, I can definitely cut more. No problem whatsoever. Now again, quite a nice cut, and that's 3/8 thick at 30 amps. Okay, now I'm plugged into a 50 amp breaker proper, so I can turn this all the way up to 50. This 3/8 is what it says. In one of the places it's the max. I'm sure it'll cut through it like butter. Real easy. Beautiful. See, once again, what a nice cut I got. Already knocked the dross off of this one. Now for one last thing, I've got this as a piece of scrap. So I'll try cutting this, see what happens. That's starting to get darn close to the limit. The last thing I'd like to do is show you the value of the 4T and why the pilot arc is so useful. So overall, this thing is really great. It's able to cut upwards of 3/4 inch steel without any real problem, and can easily handle pretty much everything under it, depending on the plug that you have to work with. Some closing thoughts I have about this unit involve two things. One, which I think is really great and useful, is that this torch is an AG60P, and I don't really know what those numbers mean, but this is a very generic torch, which means the tips are very generic. So these consumables you can buy on Amazon in bulk for like 20 bucks, which is really nice. When I went to go buy some for my Hypertherm, my God, they were really expensive. One head might cost as much as all the consumables in a kit for this. So that is really, really nice. And in addition, if you wreck this torch somehow, you can just buy another one and slap it in. And a lot of the parts from this plasma cutter are very generic, so you can replace parts pretty easily, even if something happens that Bestarc stops providing it. The other thing, though, is about duty cycle. According to Bestarc, their duty cycle is 60% at 45 amps. but that's not exactly an honest number. Typically, duty cycle is measured at 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So they'll put this in a room, it'll be 104 degrees, and they'll run it in such a way that they can measure the duty cycle. And typically, if you had a 60% duty cycle, it would be at 104 degrees, where it would work for 6 minutes out of every 10. But Bestarc did their measurements at 78 degrees Fahrenheit, and that isn't really how the standard is supposed to work. So that number is pretty much fudged, but all these cheaper welders and plasma cutters pretty much do the same thing. So you got to take that duty cycle with a grain of salt. But if you're using this in your garage that's air conditioned, that would be technically accurate. So you could expect to cut 3/4 inch steel for 6 minutes straight out of 10, then you got to wait 4 minutes. So that duty cycle doesn't really matter that much for what most people would be trying to use this unit for. And in addition to that, dealing with that 104 degrees Fahrenheit, it does say that you really shouldn't use this above 104 degrees Fahrenheit. So I would say the cooling capacity of this thing is a little bit lacking. If you're planning to use this outside in the desert on a hot day, it might turn off on you a lot to try and cool down. But besides that, in your average garage environment, I don't think it would really be a problem for you. Another thing you should be aware of is how much air is required to run this unit. There's 3 different numbers that I found online of what this thing requires to run, and they're pretty far off from one another. I would say you need at least 3 or 4 CFM to run this thing. I used a little pancake compressor that in theory can put out about 2.1 CFM at 90 PSI, which is sort of a standard number to look at. And it absolutely could not keep up with it at that rate. I had to turn it all the way down to like 25 PSI as the output for this, and it barely kept up. So you probably want to use a bigger compressor, or you got to be expecting that you're only cutting for a very short time before you run out of juice. One of the places it does recommend using around 9 CFM, which I think is a more realistic number so that you're not just constantly running your air compressor to try and keep up with this thing. So that is a bit of a bigger air compressor, but that is the deal when it comes to plasma cutters. It requires airflow. And finally, as I said in the beginning of the video, Bestarc did send this to me, but they're not paying me to say anything in particular. They just wanted me to unbox it, show you its features, and cut stuff, and then tell you what I think of it. And I think it's pretty dang good for the price. You can't really beat being able to cut steel that thick for 250 bucks or even 200 bucks if it's on sale on Amazon. So if you want to get one of these, I got links down in the description. And I also have links to some accessories you might want to just buy right off the bat. And if you've used any of these Bestarc products before, let me know down in the comments. I actually had never heard of them before they contacted me, but when I started doing research, I found out that they're a pretty big player in the cheap but good quality welders and plasma cutters in the market. So I was pretty excited to actually get a hold of this thing. I hope you found this video useful, and as always, have a good one.